Let me ask you something in a way that might feel very familiar the moment you hear it. Have you ever opened a drawer with the full intention of clearing it out, started taking things out one after the other, and then somewhere in the middle of that process, you found yourself slowing down, sitting for a moment, getting a little tired or distracted, and before you even made a clear decision, everything quietly went back into that same drawer as though nothing ever happened? If you have experienced that, then you already understand how confusing this process can feel, because it gives the impression that you are trying but not getting anywhere, even though the effort is clearly there. What most people do not realize is that this has very little to do with discipline and almost everything to do with the method they are using, because the way decluttering is often presented does not take into account how your energy works now, how your body responds to effort, or how decision-making feels when it is repeated over and over again in a short period of time. When those things are not aligned, even a simple task begins to feel heavier than it should, and instead of building momentum, each attempt quietly drains you until the idea of trying again starts to feel less appealing. That is why we're going to approach this differently, not by adding more structure or pressure, but by removing the parts that make it unnecessarily difficult and replacing them with small adjustments that make the process feel manageable and repeatable. And if you have ever started something like this and stopped halfway without really understanding why, you can tap the like button, because that small action helps this reach other people who are dealing with the exact same situation. Now, when people first decide to declutter, one of the most common instincts is to go straight for the biggest and most difficult space in the house, because it feels like the most responsible and efficient way to handle everything at once. You look around and tell yourself that if you can just deal with that one overwhelming area, whether it is the garage, the attic, or a storage space that has been untouched for a long time, then everything else will feel easier afterward. But the moment you open that space, you are not just looking at clutter, you are facing a combination of physical effort, emotional weight, and constant decision-making all happening at the same time. There are boxes that are difficult to move, the items you do not remember keeping, and objects that bring back memories you were not expecting to revisit. And all of that creates a level of pressure that builds very quickly, even if you do not notice it at first. So within a short time, your body begins to feel the strain. Your mind starts to slow down, and instead of making steady progress, you find yourself sitting, pausing, or stepping away with the intention of returning later, even though that return often becomes harder than expected. A more effective way to begin is to reduce the scale of what you are doing to something that feels almost too simple to matter, because that is where consistency starts to build. Instead of choosing an entire room or a large storage area, you choose one small, contained space, such as a single drawer or a small shelf, where the number of decisions is limited and the physical effort is minimal. When you work in a space like that, you give yourself the chance to complete the task without feeling overwhelmed, and that sense of completion creates a kind of quiet confidence that makes it easier to come back and do the same thing again. Progress is not created by how much you attempt at once, but by how often you can return to the process without resistance. And small, finished tasks make that possible. Another factor that quietly affects how this experience feels is the time you choose to do it, because many people try to declutter whenever they happen to have free time, even if that time comes when they are already tired, uncomfortable, or mentally drained from everything else they have done during the day. At that point, what should be a simple activity becomes much more difficult, because decluttering is not just about moving things around. It requires repeated decisions, and each of those decisions takes a small amount of mental energy. If you begin when that energy is already low, It does not take long before the process begins to feel frustrating, not because the task is too complex, but because your mind has reached a point where it no longer wants to keep deciding. You may notice yourself hesitating, picking things up and putting them back down, or simply losing the desire to continue, and that is usually a sign that your timing is working against you. A simple adjustment here can make a noticeable difference, because choosing to declutter at a time when you have eaten, when you have rested, and when your body feels relatively comfortable allows your mind to stay clearer for longer, which makes each decision feel easier instead of heavier. At the same time, it helps to limit how long you work, not because you are unable to continue, but because stopping at the right moment prevents the experience from becoming something you associate with exhaustion. Setting a short defined period, such as 15 minutes, allows you to focus without pressure, and when that time ends, you stop, even if you feel capable of doing more, because leaving with some energy still available makes it much easier to return later. There is also a physical habit that many people do not think about until they start to feel it in their body, and that is the tendency to do everything while standing, bending, reaching, and walking back and forth as they sort through items. Over time, that constant movement creates unnecessary strain, especially on the back and knees, and what should be a simple sorting process begins to feel physically demanding much sooner than expected. A more comfortable way to approach this is to bring the task to a position where your body can remain supported, because sitting down with a few containers placed within easy reach allows you to work in a way that reduces strain and keeps your movements controlled. When your body is not under constant pressure, your mind remains calmer, and that calmness makes it easier to continue without feeling rushed or uncomfortable, which is exactly what you want if you are trying to build a process you can return to again and again. As you begin to work in a way that feels more comfortable physically and mentally, another pattern tends to appear, and it is one that seems helpful at first but slowly creates a different kind of problem if it is not handled carefully. Many people, when they are unsure about an item, choose to set it aside in what they casually call a maybe pile, because it feels easier than making a decision in the moment, especially when the item carries some memory or a small sense of uncertainty that is difficult to resolve quickly. At the beginning, this approach feels reasonable because it allows you to keep moving without getting stuck, and for a short time, it does exactly that. But as the process continues, that small pile begins to grow in a way that is easy to overlook until it becomes its own source of pressure. What starts as a few undecided items gradually turns into a collection of delayed decisions, and each of those items quietly holds your attention in the background, waiting for you to come back and finally choose what to do with it. Over time, that pile can feel just as overwhelming as the clutter you were trying to reduce, because it represents unfinished work. And unfinished work has a way of staying present in your mind even when you are not actively thinking about it. A more effective way to handle this situation is to give that uncertainty a boundary, not by forcing yourself to decide immediately, but by containing it in a way that prevents it from spreading. Instead of allowing a growing pile, you choose a single small box, and anything you are unsure about goes into that box and nowhere else, which means the moment that box is full, you stop adding to it and continue working with clearer decisions. After some time has passed, when you return to that box with a fresh perspective, you will often find that many of the items no longer feel as important as they did in the moment, and decisions that once felt difficult become noticeably easier because you are no longer reacting emotionally, but simply deciding calmly. And if there are still a few items you truly want to keep, that is completely fine, because the goal here is not to force yourself into letting go of everything, but to reduce the weight of constant uncertainty. While you are working through items in this way, another habit can quietly make the process feel far more chaotic than it needs to be. And it usually comes from trying to be too organized too quickly. Many people decide that they will sort their belongings by category, which sounds logical, so they begin gathering similar items from different parts of the house, bringing them all into one place with the intention of dealing with everything at once. At first, this feels like progress because you are actively collecting and organizing, but very quickly that single pile begins to expand, spreading across surfaces, floors, and nearby spaces until the area you are working in no longer feels calm or manageable. Instead of focusing on one contained space, you are now surrounded by multiple layers of items from different parts of the home, and that shift makes it much harder to see progress or feel in control of what you are doing. A simpler and more sustainable approach is to work based on location rather than category, because staying in one place and dealing only with what is in front of you keeps the process contained and prevents new clutter from forming while you are trying to remove the old. When you complete one drawer, one shelf, or one small section, you can immediately see the result, and that visible progress creates a sense of order that encourages you to continue rather than leaving you surrounded by half-finished piles that feel overwhelming. There is also a situation that often arises when other people become involved in the process, and while it is usually well-intended, it can easily create tension if it is not handled carefully. Family members, especially those who want to help, may approach decluttering with a different mindset, one that is more focused on speed and efficiency rather than comfort and reflection. And that difference can lead to moments where you feel rushed, pressured, or even misunderstood. They may pick up an item and suggest getting rid of it quickly, not fully realizing that for you, that item may carry meaning or require a moment of thought before making a decision. And when those moments happen repeatedly, the experience can shift from helpful to stressful. What should feel like support begins to feel like being pushed, and that can make you withdraw from the process altogether. A better way to handle this is to set clear expectations before anyone begins helping. By explaining that you are the one who decides what stays and what goes, and that their role is to assist with the physical side of things rather than the decision-making. When that understanding is in place, the process becomes more balanced, because you maintain control over your space while still receiving the help you need, and that combination allows progress to happen without unnecessary conflict. Another quiet habit that affects motivation is the way people measure their success during the process, because it is very common to believe that progress should be visible in the form of large bags of items being removed from the home. That expectation creates a subtle pressure to produce results that look significant, and when those results do not appear, it can feel as though the effort was not worthwhile. But the reality is that meaningful progress often looks much smaller than people expect, because it is not always about how much you remove, but about how much easier your space becomes to live in. A drawer that opens smoothly, a shelf that feels lighter, or a surface that is no longer crowded may not look dramatic, but those changes improve your daily experience in ways that are far more valuable than simply counting how many items you let go of. When you shift your focus from quantity to comfort, the process becomes less stressful and more rewarding because you begin to notice the small improvements that make your home feel easier to use and more pleasant to be in. As the process continues and you begin to see small areas improving, there is one final pattern that often shows up, and it tends to undo progress in a very quiet way if it is not handled with intention. After sorting through a space, you gather a number of items that you have decided to let go of, And in that moment, it feels like a completed step. So you place those items into a bag or a box and set them aside. Usually somewhere near the door or in a corner, with the thought that you will take care of them soon. At first, that feels perfectly reasonable because you have already done the difficult part of making the decisions, but as time passes, that bag remains where it is, becoming part of the environment instead of something temporary. You walk past it, step around it, and gradually it blends into the space, and then at some point, a small thought begins to form, suggesting that it might be worth checking the contents again, just to be sure that nothing important was placed inside by mistake. Once that thought is acted upon, the process begins to reverse itself, because items that were already decided on are reconsidered, and what was once clear becomes uncertain again. This does not happen because your original decisions were wrong, but because the process was left unfinished, and unfinished steps have a way of reopening themselves. A more effective way to handle this final stage is to decide in advance what will happen to those items the moment they are sorted, so that there is no gap between decision and action. When you begin, you already know where those items are going, how they will get there, and when they will leave your space, whether that means arranging a pickup, asking someone to help, or setting a specific time to take them out yourself. That clarity removes the opportunity for second guessing, because once the items leave your home, they no longer ask for your attention, and that creates a clean sense of progress that feels complete rather than temporary. When you look at all of these patterns together, it becomes clear that the difficulty in decluttering does not come from the amount of things you own, but from the way the process interacts with your energy, your comfort, and your decision-making. When those things are not respected, even small tasks feel overwhelming. But when they are taken into account, the entire experience begins to feel more manageable, more predictable, and far less stressful. Instead of trying to do everything at once, you begin to move in smaller, steadier steps. And those steps, while they may seem modest at first, build a kind of consistency that is much more powerful than any single large effort. You clear one space, and it feels lighter, not just visually, but mentally as well, because it represents something that was completed without strain. You return another day, and you do the same in a different area, not because you're forcing yourself, but because the process no longer feels like something to avoid. Over time, those small repeated actions begin to shape your environment in a way that feels natural, creating a home that is easier to move through, easier to maintain, and more comfortable to spend time in. And that is really the purpose behind all of this, not to create perfection or to remove everything that has meaning, but to build a space that supports you, where you can sit, rest, and move around without feeling crowded or overwhelmed. So instead of thinking about everything that still needs to be done, bring your focus back to something simple and realistic. Choose one small area, something you can complete without pressure. Sit comfortably and work through it at your own pace, allowing yourself to stop when you have done enough rather than pushing until you're exhausted. When you finish, take a moment to notice what has changed, because that awareness reinforces the progress you are making and makes it easier to continue. If this has helped you see the process in a clearer and more manageable way, you can tap the like button so that others who are facing the same challenge can find this and benefit from it as well. And if you would like more guidance that feels calm, practical, and easy to follow, you can subscribe and turn on notifications so that each new video becomes another small step toward making your space more comfortable and easier to live in. Take your time with this. Move at a pace that feels right for you, and remember that meaningful change does not come from rushing, but from steady, Thoughtful actions that you can return to again and again without feeling overwhelmed.